Welcome to the Living the Dream podcast with Curveball. If you believe, you can achieve. Welcome to the Living the Dream with Curveball podcast, a show where I interview guests that teach, motivate, and inspire. Today, we're going to be talking about the Andes disaster, as I am joined by author John Guiver. John turned to being a writer after a career in artificial intelligence and high-tech software. He started researching the Andes disaster. He first started as a hobby. Now it's full-time. So we're going to be talking about his book, To Play the Game, that he released in 2022 on the 50-year anniversary of the Andes disaster. So, John, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be on your show. Thank you very much, Curtis.
Why don't you start off by telling everybody a little bit about yourself?
Well, my name's John Guiver. I'm based in the UK. I'm 69 now. I had a career in technical research and development. Spent many years in the field of artificial intelligence. I have a family, 3 kids, a wife, and I was always very interested in the 1972 Andes disaster. It was a story that struck a deep chord. And in 2013, I started researching it in earnest. And 2019, I started writing a history of the event, did many interviews. And as you say, the book came out in December 2022 on the 50th anniversary.
So first of all, what inspired you to want to get involved in researching the Andes disaster, and what inspired you to write about it?
Well, I'd read the authorized account of the event, of the tragedy. I probably read the book alive in mid-80s, I think. And it was written by an English author, Piers Paul Reed, who spent a long time interviewing the survivors in a couple of months after they returned from the mountain. And there were many things I found fascinating about the story. They were a very close-knit group. They'd all come from a community where family was important. They had big families. It was a Catholic community. It was a rugby playing school. All of that resonated with me. And then all of a sudden they were plunged into this tragedy. And Piers Paul Reed, who wrote Alive, he did a very good job of really allowing us to get to know these young men. But I always felt there was a gap in the story, and that was we didn't really know too much about those who died in the accident, who were also from the very same close-knit community. And that was really one of the big focuses of my book and got me going. And the thing that sort of triggered my connection with the community was a trip to the site of the accident in 2013. I went there. It's a 6-day trip. You go up on horseback in the summer, not in the conditions that the victims and the survivors were in. And through that, I met one of the survivors, and through him, I met some other survivors. And gradually, I became quite embedded in the community. I translated a couple of memoirs of survivors. And I also had contacted Piers Paul Reed, who wrote the book Alive, and he was very supportive of my interest and my project, my thought to write a more complete history. And he made his archival material available to me. So I became very knowledgeable about the story and also connected through my contacts with the survivors and with the families of those who didn't return.
So, for listeners who don't know, explain what the Andes disaster actually is.
So this was a group of a rugby team and their friends, some family members. They're from Uruguay, which is in the eastern part of South America. They'd all gone to the same school, and they were old boys, as it were, of alumni of this primary and middle school, and they'd formed a club. And the club had become one of the most successful in Uruguay. It hadn't been going for many years, but they were a close-knit group, and they chartered a plane to take them to play a team of similar standing in Chile. To get to Chile, you cross the Andes. The pilots took a wrong turn in the mountains. The plane dropped out of the clouds in an air pocket, and the pilots saw they were heading towards a 15,000-foot ridge. They desperately tried to clear the ridge, weren't able to. The wings got clipped, came off. The tail of the plane came off. Some of the passengers were sucked out by the decompression. But the fuselage, without its wings and without its tail, miraculously landed on the other side of the ridge and tobogganed down about a mile into a valley high in the Andes, a remote valley that no one visited. And remarkably, there were 33 people still alive after the initial impact. A few died within the next 10 hours. But there were 29 survivors after the first day. They, of course, believed they would be rescued within a day or two. But time went on, and it was clear that they weren't going to be rescued. They had made several abortive attempts to walk in different directions. It was too cold. The snow was too deep. Eventually, they didn't have food. They had to resort to using the bodies of their friends, their close friends. There were many incidents on the mountain, but they were lost for 72 days. Eventually, two of them managed to trek out. They had a 10-day trek out of the Andes. They were spotted high in the Chilean side of the Andes by a cattleman who had gone to take his flocks up to the mountains for their summer summer pasturage, and the rescue force. He alerted the rescue forces, and they rescued by that time 16 survivors, and it was, of course, a massive story. There were many books written, and there was the film, and more films have come out about it.
Well, speaking of books, why do you feel that your book is different than all the other books that were written about this tragedy?
Well, my initial and overriding goal was to balance the story. We have this iconic story that will be remembered hundreds of years from now, a unique story. The survivors, the 16 survivors, have been very high profile. They've written memoirs. They've been interviewed countless times, especially in Latin America. And they do corporate conferences and so on. But it's just a twist of fate that it was, a survivor versus a victim, depending on where they were sitting when the plane crashed. And because this was such a close-knit community, I felt it was very important to not only tell the stories of those who died on the mountain, but also of their families and their families' experience during the episode when their sons were lost, when the 16 survivors were found and came back into the community in the years afterwards, and to tell that story. So that was my sort of goal, but I also wanted to provide context for the whole story. So I wanted to provide a little bit about the historical and political and social context that this close-knit community came from. So I provide a little history of Uruguay and of the community they came from. I also do an air crash investigation, which has never really been thoroughly investigated. So I have a section in the book on that. And then I have, I talk about the years since the accident, the way the rugby club recovered, the way the families recovered, and so on, the 50 years since that tragedy.
Well, kind of talk about, expand on the aftermath of the tragedy. You know, how did it affect the close-knit community?
Well, it was, first of all, for the families who lost people, they were really extraordinarily generous in their support of the survivors, because you know their sons had died twice effectively. They'd been given up for dead in the original accident. Then there'd been this moment of hope when they thought, well, maybe my son is still living, and then they find out, well, they're not on this list of 16. But many of the parents felt that the survivors were going to have a very difficult time because of what they'd done, and they expressed their immediate support for the survivors, saying that they, you know, one of the fathers said it was good that there were 45 people on the plane, so 16 people could have their sons back, and it was so there was this extraordinary outpouring of generosity from several of the families who lost people. The event itself tended to be talked about less in Uruguay than in the rest of the world. Uruguay was undergoing a very difficult period in its history. It had come to a point where it was on the cusp of a military dictatorship, and Uruguay had been a country that was a very liberal and democratic country within South America. There were, you know, parties from all sides were allowed to prosper and publish, you know, have publications. But it had come to a point where the military took over the government, and so this all happened against the backdrop of that, and so the whole attention on the story was a little bit muted within Uruguay itself. Within the community itself, the survivors really didn't like to talk about what had happened because they didn't want to open wounds for the families who'd lost people. And these were friends of the survivors who'd been lost, their dear friends who'd been lost on the mountain. So for many years, the story really wasn't talked about. Now, there were a couple of activities that sort of helped the community stay together and sort of help them through the aftermath of the tragedy. One of these was the rugby club. So not everyone was part of the rugby club, but there was a good portion that were part of the rugby club. And the rugby club prospered after the accident, and it rebuilt. and actually became one of the most successful sides in Uruguayan club history. And that whole activity was not just a rugby club, it was a social club. They tried to do good within the community. So that provided a support mechanism. Another support mechanism that happened was that 13 of the mothers who lost their sons got together and they said, look, we're just going to, we need to stop grieving. We need to do something positive. So they started a library with the purpose of, through membership of the library, the money would be used to help poorer communities around in the neighborhood of the community that the survivors were from. And that community was quite a prosperous one. But around there were various poor communities. There were school children who couldn't afford school books. And so there's this program put together to try and provide, to give to these poorer communities. And they did that in memory of their sons who died on the mountain. And that library is actually still going strong. It's been going for more than 50 years now. The daughters, the sisters of those who died on the mountain have taken over the running of the library. It now provides scholarships, it provides computer classes, and so on, again, to help these poorer communities. So a lot of good actually came out of this, and these activities helped those who were suffering this tragedy to recover from it.
Okay, everybody, it's Michael E. Cullen II.
And I'm Sesame and Carta from the All Too Real 2 podcast. We're passionate about movies, TV, and pretty much all things pop culture.
Dive into the chaos of failed sitcoms, direct-to-video sequels, and the quirky realms of cinema and TV.
Join us every Thursday for your dose of All Too Real 2 entertainment.
We'll guide you through debates like whether Howard the Duck qualifies as a superhero.
Ponder if Larry the Cable Guy could be the new Rock or Schwarzenegger.
Discover if some shows and movies should have stayed in the cutting room.
Ever heard of a sitcom featuring that dictator with the funny mustache? Well, we watched it.
We're dedicated to unraveling the peculiarities of pop culture, sometimes with awesome guests.
So, if you're into the eccentric world of pop culture,
listen and subscribe to All Too Real 2.
Available wherever you find podcasts
and on Age of Radio.
Well, tell us why you decided to name the book To Play the Game.
Right. So the rugby team, the school that the passengers had gone to was run by a group of Christian brothers, the Irish Christian brothers, who came from Ireland, and the rugby was this sort of vehicle to not only provide sporting activity, but also to provide a way of living. So the values of rugby, such as discipline, teamwork, respect, and so on, these are all part of the values that the Christian brothers wanted to teach. So when they played rugby, they had this prayer, these Christian brothers, and it went like this: "It's all in this to play the game, to win or lose and be the same, to take the blame, to smile the while, oh help me Lord, to play the game. For when the one great scorer comes to write against your name, he'll ask not if you won or lost, but how you played the game." So there are people who won and there are people who lost on the mountain, people who didn't come back. But the way they responded to this tragedy, the way the families responded to the tragedy, was the important, aspect of this. It's how you live your life that's important. We all suffer, some of us from tragedies, some of us, not so much. But it's how you respond to that and how you continue your life. That's the key takeaway here.
Well, speaking of those who didn't come back, in your book, you have a big focus on telling their story too. So why was it important for you to focus on them and talk about them as well as the survivors?
Well, I think, first of all, it was a close-knit community, and it could easily have been those who died who were actually survivors and were raised to this high profile. I think in such an iconic story, I think it's very important to understand the full breadth of the story. Yes, there was, it's a fantastic thing, these survivors coming back, but it was also a tragedy. And I think we have to reflect on that tragedy. We have to understand that people went through great suffering, and we have to understand that suffering. So when I tell their stories, I talk about their families, their childhood, the build up to the trip, their friends and incidents from their friendships with some of the survivors, and the whole period during the accident. So I think it's very important to tell those stories. And it's important to provide a balance. My own, I was thinking, there's a story about Sir Ernest Shackleton, who was an explorer in the Antarctic. And he was stranded with his men for many, many weeks in the South Atlantic. It's an incredible story, and there have been many, many books written about it. And when I read those books, I love reading about this story, but I always wonder about some of the people who are just names. And we don't really know about them because history doesn't record about them, much information about them. So what I wanted to do was to record for history some of these information about some of these people that just appear as names in most of the books, and to bring them to life, in a sense, for the reader and for history.
Well, tell us about any upcoming projects that you're working on that listeners need to be aware of.
Well, we spent a long time doing a translation into Spanish, because this story is actually more popular and more well known in the Spanish-speaking world, both in Spain and in Latin America. And so that came out late last year and is available for if you have any Spanish listeners. Currently, I'm working on a family project. I'm documenting the travels of my great-grandmother, who traveled by herself through West Africa, northern West Africa, in 1931 and 1932. And so as a single traveler traveling through, many remote villages and speaking to lots of people, her diaries and her photographs are, I think, a very important record of that time, that time of colonial time in colonial French Africa. And so that's taking up a lot of my time. Whether that will get published, outside the family yet is still to be determined.
Well, throw out your contact info so people can keep up with everything that you're up to.
Sorry, can you ask that again, Curtis?
Throw out your contact info so people can keep up with everything that you're up to.
Okay, the best way to find out information about my book and any future projects is my website. It's johnguiver.org. That's JOHNGUI, for Victor, ER.org. And there you have a link to books, digital and physical, and you have some context for the story, and you have links to interviews, podcasts, documentaries, and so on.
will close us out with some final thoughts. Maybe if there was something I forgot to talk about that you would like to touch on, or any final thoughts you have for the listeners.
I think there are some very important lessons to be learnt from the story, and perhaps what I'll do is, my book doesn't concentrate a lot on the survivors, except as part of the overall flow of the book. Obviously, I talk about them throughout the book, but I don't have a chapter on each of the survivors like I do with those who didn't survive. But what I did do was I asked them the question, what lesson from the story would you pass on to your grandchildren? And I want to read you maybe some of those. So this one's from a survivor called Pedro Algorta. Said, what lesson from the story would you pass on to your grandchildren? Simply that life has to be lived and it is hard. There are no easy roads, but no matter how many difficulties we encounter, we can always get up and keep walking. Here's another one. Never tire of doing good. We complain that things are not getting better, but before complaining, ask yourself, what can you do to make things better? We all have something to contribute, to give. And here's another one, to value and enjoy life, that we are fortunate for everything we have, to be respectful of people, to be independent. Here's one, he says, I would speak to my grandchildren about happiness, about how you have to merit it and then find peace in life and not just the abyss of death. Living in peace ensures health, and you become free and live without fear and live in truth. This is the meaning of life, and it starts with giving and giving yourself to others, and then you will be worthy of happiness. And there are many other little things like that that I think are very, very important. So let me just finish there, Curtis.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, johnguiver.org. Please be sure to check out the book. Follow, rate, review, share this episode to as many people as possible. If you have any guest or suggestion topics, Curtis Jackson 1978 at att.net is the place to send them. Jump on your favorite podcast app. Follow us. Leave a review. Thank you for listening and supporting the show. And John, thank you for bringing this tragedy to light and all that you're doing.
Well, thank you very much for having me on your show, Curtis.
For more information on the Living the Dream podcast, visit www.djcurveball.com. Until next time, stay focused on living the dream.